Thank you so much, Aditya, for that fine introduction. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all the participants on the call. I believe it has been a good, fruitful, long conversation for you today, looking at the agenda that was shared with me. And obviously, my session is the last session, so I'm trying to make it as interesting for you, right? As Aditya mentioned, you could see that I have come with a lot of expertise around looking at different types of technologies, have worked in different kinds of markets, and specifically the experiences that I carry around the aspects of working in the dot-com age, before the dot-com age, and after the dot-com age, right? Obviously, a lot of us have seen the goods and the bads of the dot-com age, but that were interesting times. Again, these times are very interesting, and that's when I got this opportunity to talk about what we do at CyberRes with our 45 brand for application security. I thought it was a good opportunity to share with you what we can do and how you could leverage some of these expertise, either in terms of you consuming those technologies, you promoting those technologies, or you kind of picking up those technologies and becoming experts around it. Okay. So, yeah. So what I'm going to talk today is specifically going to focus around the aspects of the concepts of shift security left. In the industry, the jargon is also known as shift left, right? And today that jargon is being pushed towards shift right. And some people are taking it a step further and kind of calling it out as shift everything for that matter, right? So there are different ways of looking at this, but the fact still remains that it's all about how do you introduce security within the DevOps environment or the DevOps processes that you have set up in your setup. As Aditya mentioned, I basically am responsible for sales enablement globally for our company, CyberRes, and CyberRes is part of Micro Focus. Let's jump in. I think this is very common sight that I believe most of us experience on a day-to-day basis, right? It would be very difficult to imagine that you are a user who's not using mobile today. And when we look at our mobile and we start looking at all the applications that we are accessing, we generally look at the convenience of how that application is going to be made, give us access to that environment and make it easy and simple for us to leverage that application, right? But when we imagine how the hacker looks at that information, it's a very different scenario. Each of that capability that the application is being provided to you on the mobile has an opportunity to be hacked and has an opportunity to potentially either restrict your access, steal your data, get you to lose your credibility, or maybe if it is a ransomware, potentially get you into a corner where you may have to pay up money to get some of your important files unlocked from your device. And this is not something which is uncommon, right? We've seen in the industry this happening all over the place. And if we just look at a common vulnerability type, SQL injection, this is an example of the Heartland payment system, where a hacker basically used this technique to get into the payment system. And once they hacked the payment system, they were able to get access to their payment processing server. And from the payment processing server, they were able to steal a lot of revenue, about 130 million plus was the financial cost to the organization. The reason I thought of picking up this example and talking about it is because of the fact that for some of you who may be in the software development space, you may realize, hold on, SQL is a very old technology. We understand what's the right way of writing the SQL commands. Why should this be a problem? And I think that is exactly where the problem is, that even though it is such a known vulnerability, it keeps on surfacing as the top vulnerability because of which the hacks are happening in the industry, right? And that is where it becomes important to understand how some of these things are kind of moving into the industry. So if you look at market observations, what is happening in the market today, obviously it goes without saying that there is no application which comes without a vulnerability or a security issue, right? The security research that we have within our organization, they had come out with these statistics, and these statistics are alarming. As you can see, most of the application types, irrespective of where they are hosted and run from, they have a large amount of security vulnerability into them. Some of these vulnerabilities are covered in the OWASP top 10, and I believe some of you understand OWASP, which is the Open Web Application Security Program. They are a open source body who are basically focusing on helping customers realize which are these vulnerabilities and how to tackle those vulnerabilities. Okay, so obviously, if you think about the way companies are adopting DevOps, right? And sorry, I think the transition is not coming up over here. But if you think about the way companies are adopting DevOps, their primary objective for DevOps has been in terms of how to increase the automation, because there's a large number of developers. There is stringent requirements of faster releases, right? And they want to reduce the latency, the time between the different builds that are released, the different capabilities that are released. But at the same time, from a security standpoint, they also want to increase visibility. They want to figure out what's happening with the software, what are the components getting into that software, who's doing what, are there any issues that we need to address, and so on and so forth. In this entire maze of things, security often gets left out. And the reason for that is not because the customer does not appreciate the need for security. The reason for that is more because of the fact that the number of developers compared to the number of security teams within the customer is very small. And that's where you see the 100:1 ratio, right? With the kind of development work streams coming out from the customer's environment, security is not able to catch up. And that is where the basic challenge starts for the customer. Okay. Just give me 1 second. Let me just change the sharing of my screen. Otherwise, this will probably... Aditya, if you can just confirm if you can see my screen.
I can see your screen. You have a graph on, right?
Yes. What needs to happen?
Yes.
Okay,
what needs
perfect.
to happen?
Perfect. Thank you so much. So obviously the reason I wanted to change the screen is because there are a lot of animations in my slide and you'll probably not get that if we run through that previous format. So coming back to the messaging, I think if you think about what's really happening with the security not getting included into DevOps, the moment the security vulnerabilities are identified at later stage, right, the cost of remediating those vulnerabilities keeps on increasing. And you can see that that cost increase is quite exponential. Something that could be addressed during the coding stage, if you address it into the production stage, the cost implications are at least 30 times, right? From a standpoint of the cost involved for addressing it. And this is where most of the customers are trying to figure out how do they shift security left? How do they bring security early in the development cycle while the developers are coding the systems to ensure that some of these cost implications can be addressed, right? This is where Fortify has been focused. Over the last 10 years, Fortify has been in the Gartner's Magic Quadrant. We have been there as one of the pioneers of application security, and we have a large install base of customers who see strong benefits from the context of what we deliver as technology, right? Now, if we think about Devsecops in the perspective of the fact that customers want to shift security left into the DevOps lifecycle, Devsecops is really the practice of incorporating that security, right? And while that security is being incorporated, it needs to be incorporated at all stages of the development. Because as you appreciate and understand, DevOps is all about automation. DevOps is all about bringing different components and synchronizing those components so that as the development progresses, each component comes and plays its roles and ensures that the quality of the build remains intact so that when it gets into production, there are minimum issues, right? And that basically speeds up the whole process of release. So you want to potentially think of introducing security at each stage of that development lifecycle, and that is where Devsecops comes into the picture. Why it is important? Obviously, we saw financial cost as one of the aspects. The other aspect is obviously the competitive rate at which the customer wants to come out with new applications. Imagine if there were so many security issues in terms of the applications being rolled out without security, The developers wouldn't have enough time to look at innovation, come out with new functionalities that are required for the growth of the business, right? So most of the time, customers today don't need the opportunity to say, why do you need security in your application life cycle, right? People understand that, and they are potentially looking from a context of how do we make this much better than where they are currently. And that brings to the context of how do you implement Devsecops. And if you see the representation on this chart, it basically tries to help you appreciate the fact that when security is being considered between development and operations, which stands for Dev and Ops, that is where you are potentially starting to see the magic kind of unraveling, right? Because when you think about security in a development environment, at one end, you would basically say, okay, let the developer close the application, develop the application, we will test it out, right? The traditional way of testing applications. But by that time, it would be too late because there could have been a lot of issues in the way the code has been written. Some of the known vulnerabilities would have been already there into that environment and so on and so forth. So that is where it becomes important that security becomes integrated within the developer's workstation, and that developer then has the expertise where he can start looking at the inputs that they receive from the application security tool to say, what is it that you are writing? How can you write it better? What are the challenges if you continue to write it in this manner and so on and so forth, right? And that's the whole process from a context of how do you integrate security at the time of the coding, at the time of the build process, and at the time of the UATs or the test process, right? And then when you think of the right aspects of security, which is the security in operations, that's where the traditional security operations or the security operations centers would come in, right? You would want to continuously monitor what's happening with that application. Does it need patching? Are we logging and auditing that environment? What kind of threats are coming in, and so on and so forth. The integration of all these three things coming together is what the customer is ideally expecting as they continue to consider shifting security left within Devsecops. Obviously, if we think about the success criteria, this is not only about technology. There's a large expectation from a context of the customer's different business units to have an open collaboration. Unlike in the past where people were working in silos, oh, you develop the application, give it to us, we'll test it and then deploy it. It doesn't work in that manner today, right? It's a kind of an assembly pipeline for the customer, and the customer typically wants to ensure that everybody is working together to ensure they know what's coming in and what is the status with that setup. Obviously, you want to shift security left, you want to have actionable insights so that you can potentially look at prioritizing the vulnerabilities identified and remediate vulnerabilities. You want to reinforce automation. You want to ensure that can repetitive tasks be taken care by automation so that it increases productivity of the developers. And finally, you want to look at a holistic approach, right? Because at the end of the day, it's not only about knowing the security, it's also about your compliance status, it's also about your KPIs that you're committed to your business unit and so on and so forth. So let's take this opportunity to now think of how we can introduce the security into DevOps and the conversation for today's topic, right? The three main things that we are going to focus on is in the aspects of how do we make integration possible with what the developers are using. Two, how do we automate what the customer already has in terms of open source DevOps tool chains, SDLCs, the software development lifecycle environments, cloud environments that the customer may be using, and so on and so forth. And then finally, agility, right? Because no developer is going to be looking at security unless and until that security is not going to become a friction on his day-to-day work, right? So they wouldn't want to bring in security as a showstopper. Rather, they would want to say that, yes, this is helping me in terms of delivering the right quality software that the business needs. And that is how they would be interested to kind of invest their time and effort in looking at the security insights that come in as they start developing the code, right? We're going to focus on integration, automation, and agility. Now, when you think about application security tools, most of the application security tools in the industry are point purpose tool, right? They would do some specific aspects of what is required by the customer, and it would probably deliver its capability in that domain. What we do at 45 is to potentially provide an automation platform which delivers an end-to-end application security view to the customer. Think of different personas within the customer environment, right? You may have CXO level personas who may want to have visibility around the key performance indicators. How fast are we delivering it? What kind of security vulnerabilities ratio we are finding, right? How many of them we are remediating? So there could be different performance indicators that the CXO level persona may be interested in. A security persona may be interested from a context of what kind of vulnerabilities are trending. Are we seeing something different than what we were anticipating before we started this development, before we started making our presumptions around deploying this application and so on? Developers would want to look from a context of saying, are we using the right kind of codes, right? Are these projects healthy? Are these vulnerabilities something that can be addressed even before we bring it into the tool chain? So that is where, if you think about the requirement for the customer basically requires a centralized dashboard where all of these people can come together and then collaborate around the specific functions that each of these personas are going to do. What we deliver within this end-to-end application security platform is the capability for static application security testing, dynamic application security testing, interactive application security testing, software composition analysis, as well as training. Each of these we are going to get into a bit more details as we go down the conversation going forward. I talked about the Software Security Center, the Software Security Research. This is one of the unique capability for CyberRes, where we have a large team of researchers who keep on looking at the kind of vulnerabilities that exist in the environment, and they potentially build the necessary rule packs to ensure that those vulnerabilities can be detected by the customer, and we can make recommendations in terms of how those vulnerabilities can be addressed. We also deliver a managed service platform, which is called Fortify on Demand. Imagine taking all our tools, we running that environment for you, we doing the security analysis for you. That is what Fortify on Demand would look like, right? You just provide the code to us, or you just provide the request for scanning an web application, depending on what your environment and your requirements would be. We would do the analysis and give you a report back. And then finally, we will talk about Software Security Center as we go down this conversation. So when we think about the Software Security Center, this is the centralized platform where you can potentially think of the brain for the entire Devsecops platform, because it can potentially create those triggers to publish different kinds of triggers back into the build systems for doing those security checks. It can merge the security findings that are going to come from the different scans that are happening by different developers or within the different stages of the Devsecops pipeline. It basically is going to help with APIs to ensure that these integrations are available out of the box. So you don't need to figure out how do I take this and integrate with a build server, or take this and integrate with a ticketing system, and so on and so forth. So all those integrations come out of the box, right? Most of the customers today, because of the volume of applications that are getting pushed out, they need scalable scanning systems. And this is where the Scan Central comes into picture. Think of it more like a orchestrating engine, which can potentially scale up your requirements for scanning or scale them down depending on what your needs are. And all of this is running over a container technology, so makes it very easy for you to deploy, easy to manage, and at a much lower cost, right? You could do complete source code visualization. So anybody could come onto this piece, look at who has the right role for accessing that environment, look at what was the application code, what were the specific lines of issues in that code, and then potentially drill into that information to find out how to remediate that environment, right? Obviously, we provide centralized reporting. This becomes very relevant not only in the context of looking at the productivity of the developers, looking at the KPIs from a security standpoint, but it also delivers the capability around compliance. Because if you think about application security, there are multiple compliance standards that customers would want to run from. And if you are able to bring all this information together into a centralized platform, it becomes easier to bring out compliance reports to show you that for a specific compliance standard, how does your applications fare, right? So we've got a lot of compliance report templates available as part of the platform, depending on your requirements, whether they are PCI DSS, whether they are GDPR, whether they are SOX, whether they are the OWASP top 10. Depending on what your requirements are, you can generate those reports and look at the quality of your software from a security standpoint. Now, if you think of the application development today, majority of the application comes from open source, right? The reason for that is because open source is freely available, delivers the functionality that the developer needs. So instead of spending time on rewriting that application, the developer is looking at how do they reuse that software. And the challenge with that approach is that as per the security analysis that has been done, 90% of the vulnerabilities in the applications come from security vulnerabilities that exist within the reuse of this code, right? And a lot of times it is either called technical debt, or it is called, or it is coming from open source, from a context of the libraries and the projects that they are using. So eventually there is a need for shifting security left. Before figuring out which open source package to be used, there has to be what we call as software composition analysis, visibility in terms of what is being consumed from the open source community. Obviously, what we deliver as a solution in this space is to give you an ability to scan the software, look at the underlying components, identify the dependencies, identify the vulnerabilities, and suggest how those vulnerabilities can be addressed, looking at the right versions, looking at the right kind of packages, and ensure that this process becomes easier. And many vulnerabilities are stubbed right at the stage when the open source libraries are brought into the development lifecycle. License compliance is the other issue. This is where we help with software bill of material. I believe some of you would be aware that in the recent executive order which has been issued by the United States, software transparency from a context of supply chain has been one of the key aspects that executive order talks about, right? So you don't want to bring in unwanted licenses into your code because it would have financial impacts, right? Somebody can make a claim onto you and say you are doing a license violation, and that can become a financial impact for you. And then finally, you want to look at community health. The reason for that is you don't want to pick something which is end of life, or you don't want to pick something which has not been developed over a long period of time, because it would potentially create issues for you as you go down trying to maintain and further enhance your software. And all of this comes with full policy automation, right? Which means that you can define how those rules should apply, where it should stop, where it should give an alert, and how it should basically come up as the development lifecycle moves forward. This is where we provide two different brands of capabilities. One is with Sonatype, and second is with a company called Debrick that we acquired recently. And what we do over here is exactly in terms of taking when the developer is trying to pull the code from the repositories, these tools will get into action, start looking at what's happening with those source code packages, and provide you the insights to ensure that you can pick the right pieces, right? So we try to address the open source security issues right at the start when the code is going to come into the development lifecycle. Obviously, this addresses the known vulnerabilities, because at an open source level, we are looking at what are the CVEs associated with those vulnerabilities. There is a database in that tool which would map and say, these are the CVEs and these are the ways you can rectify that CVE, right? Either you patch that or you basically mitigate that by saying, let me not take this library, let me take a different library. So there could be ways in terms of figuring out the known issues. The issue starts when you want to look at the unknown vulnerabilities, which is in the code which the developer is writing. And this is where we bring the SAS capability. The static code analyzer from 45 is one of the strong analyzer, has got multiple engines, and we look at it in a very detailed manner, right? As we try to look at figuring out what's going wrong in that environment. So while we think about the static code analyzer, it's important that it gets integrated in the IDE of the developer. So we work with most of the IDEs that the developers use, whether Eclipse or Visual Studio, or for that matter, the Sun Eclipse, yeah, Eclipse or Visual Studio, right? And what this plugin is going to do is that as the developer is writing the code, it is going to potentially highlight the line of code where there is a vulnerability, provide the level of criticality to say that here is a level of criticality, and then give you insights in terms of how would you be able to remediate that, right? So it gives you the guidance to say this is how you should be looking at, these are the implications if you continue to write it in this manner. Potentially give you enough information so that the developer can rewrite that code or amend that code to maintain the functionality but address the security vulnerability issues, right? Once the developer has kind of gone through that process, obviously there could be a scenario where the developer may not be just doing the security analysis on their workstation, but they may be pushing the code into a DevOps process or onto a build server. Now, this is where you would want to build quality gates, right? Something like a security quality gate, so that when a new piece of code comes into the build server, it should automatically trigger saying that yes, a new code has come, please check for vulnerability. This is where we provide a large wealth of integrations out of the box. We potentially integrate with most of the open source components that are used by customers within their DevOps tool chains, right? Whether these are build servers, Jenkins, these are repositories like GitHub, ticketing systems like Jira or any of the other open source technologies. So we've got a lot of these integrations which are available for customers to leverage, and these integrations come out of the box, which means that there is, as part of the documentation, there is information in terms of how would you build those integration and create a connection between those two systems. Now, once the customer has moved into integrating those systems, that is where the customer starts thinking from a context of, is there a way I can increase my scan speed? Because the volume of application development is so high that if the scan speeds become low, developers would start seeing it as a resistance, right? They would want to kind of say, no, hold on, we don't want to scan it here because it's stopping my pipeline. So that is where the concept of scan speeds come in. And what we have done in this space is to potentially provide an ability for the organization to take a call in terms of what level of scans you want to do. We call it the speed dial, right? So if the customer says, hey, this application is still going to be tested later on in the UAT process, let's just do a light scan, maybe that becomes much faster. But if the customer says that, no, this is a patch which is going into the production system and we need to do a deep scan, sure, you could put your scan speeds on that manner. So flexibility lies within the developer and the security teams to figure out what level of scans they want to do within the code that is moving through that pipeline. Obviously, when these scans are being done, they are going to come out with reports around what are the vulnerabilities. And that is where the concept of noise comes, right? If you think about most of the developers, most of the security analysts, they are concerned with the aspects of false positives. They don't want to be working on a vulnerability which is not there, but the tool is basically coming out and saying, no, hold on, there is a vulnerability and you need to triage and mitigate that, right? So auditing becomes time consuming because of the kind of volume of applications, the kind of vulnerabilities that the tool will detect. This is where we build machine learning capabilities as part of our platform, right? To deliver actionable results. We deliver two capabilities here. The first capability is an audit assistant. It's a machine learning platform. You can train that model to say that these are the vulnerabilities relevant to me. Basis of what filtering you are doing on the vulnerabilities, it will learn, saying that you are skipping these vulnerabilities. So next time when the reports are pushed to the audit assistant, it will potentially filter out and say that, okay, these are the only highly critical vulnerabilities. The other vulnerabilities in your environment are probably not as critical, and that kind of saves you time to start moving further in terms of your triaging and remediation of the vulnerabilities. The other thing that we provide is an audit workbench, and this is a tool which a lot of security managers love. The reason for that is they can pick any code file from an environment, or they can pick an existing scan report from the Software Security Center, bring it onto their workstation and start triaging that information in the language, in the pictures that they are comfortable with, right? So we would do grouping of vulnerabilities to say, here are the vulnerabilities that you are seeing within this code, what you see on this screen in terms of privacy violations, SQL injection, and then customer can then use that as an opportunity to disseminate that work across different people, right? Saying some people could only work on one aspect, some people could work on other aspect, and potentially make it more efficient to ensure that they are able to achieve their security objectives. The other aspect that comes in when we start thinking about this process of increased scan times. A lot of times customers don't want to wait for the scans to get over, because again, the volume of the requirements is so high that they want to have multiple scans going on. And this is where we do automation within the scan technology, which means that instead of the system waiting for a single scan to get completed, we can potentially give you a farm of scan sensors where the load can be distributed, and the scan results can then be consumed by the developers for the purpose of their progressing the development cycle further. This is where we delivered the Scan Central, which is the centralized scanning technology from 45. And if you think of all these different pieces that I spoke till now, if we were to put these pieces together, here is how it would look like, right? The developer starts developing and checking in code on their IDE. They may push that code from a source control repository where it would potentially get into an integration server. At the integration server, it will then trigger the tool to come out and say, start the static assessment. If there are open source components, it will start triggering the SCA component to go out and do an analysis on that code. From here, the report will be then pushed to the auditors for them to see what are the kind of vulnerabilities that have been identified from the system. These auditors can then push the vulnerabilities both from the in-house developed code as well as the open source components being used, bring it together into a vulnerability management system. On the vulnerability management system, they can prioritize and identify which are the vulnerabilities that they want to work on and they want a remediation to happen. This is where they can then potentially push those specific vulnerabilities into a defect system or a ticketing system. The developer can then pick up the code from the defect system and then can start working on it, right? On the other hand, if you think about it, if the scanning requirements are high, then the continuous integration server can potentially trigger a scan to the scan farm, the Scan Central SAS controller that you see over here, and then it can distribute the load across various scan workers. So effectively what we saw till now is the fact that when you think about our 45 SaaS solution, it is a very comprehensive solution. It not only focuses on delivering the capability of identifying vulnerabilities, but it also addresses the needs for integration and automation. It also takes care of the requirements for scaling of the scan requirements and provides actionable results on which the security analyst can work on. We are very proud to say that in the OWASP 1.2b benchmark, the accuracy of our scans was near to 100, right? And that basically shows the viability of our audit assistant, the machine learning capabilities that we bring to the table to help reduce the false positives. We, as part of our software security research, we have a large wealth of knowledge base in terms of the kind of vulnerabilities that we can detect through our rule packs, the kind of APIs that we can scan. Over 1 million plus APIs is what we can scan as part of our existing rule packs, right? And then when you think of the SaaS solution, all of these pieces come together, right? These pieces come together to ensure that the insights from one tool is made available to the next, and that potentially gives the developer and the security analyst to the opportunity to work together, right? The other aspect that comes in is DAST. DAST is a dynamic security testing tool. Most of the time it is used as a tool in penetration testing. After the application has been moved into the testing phase, customers would typically take a release candidate and then they would potentially run the DAST as a black box testing, right? They would look at what are the kind of vulnerabilities when this application is going to be running. What we are trying to do with our DAST technology is to try and see how we can take that DAST capability and push it into the design or the development phase, right? Again, shifting DAST left into the security lifecycle. And the way we do this is we look at the automation that is built into the DAST platform. We look at the functional testing that the developers are going to do around their application, take insights from that functional testing and use that as the macro for the DAST tool to understand where to crawl within that application and how to poke the application to find necessary issues before it moves into production. Again, this is a very comprehensive technology. We not only support web applications, single page applications, APIs, but we also deliver a wealth of compliance reports, integrate into the CI/CD systems, so it can again become a quality gate. If customer wants to ensure that once the application is moving out from UAT, it has to go through DAST, and only if the reports, the compliance reports meet with the requirements, then the application should go forward. Obviously, you can push that automation within that. One of the other thing that we have built into DAST recently is the ability for doing hacker level insights. This is very relevant with the Log4j kind of vulnerabilities, where not everything is going to be sitting in your environment, and there are going to be some things which are going to be installed in the environment that you are going to be testing, right? So we do an out of band application security testing as part of a capability that we are building into DAST. Other capability that we bring in within DAST is the ability to further reduce noise by integrating SAST and DAST together. Using a single taxonomy, we can now look at what are the vulnerabilities that we found from DAST, compare it with the vulnerabilities that we found in SAST, and then prioritize the common vulnerabilities to ensure that we are not working on the ones which may be false positives, right? Okay, I think we had a slide there. Great. So we kind of bring that together and ensure that there is prioritization, common taxonomy, right? And there's a layered defense, because a lot of times what customers would do is they would say, I have done my source code analysis, let me go and push it out into production. What they forget is the fact that the code will behave in one way when it has been written, but the code will behave in a different way when there are different components coming together, and the interaction of those components may create various other scenarios in which the code may behave differently, right? So it's important that you do a SAST and a DAST, both of them combined, before you kind of go out and build the software security assurance on top of your applications. Obviously, we bring these results together in SSC. The benefit of doing this is that we can now bring open source results, we can bring the source code results, we can bring the runtime application results, and all of those results together can provide the customer with additional insight. For example, on this slide, the example that I've tried to show is the fact that there is an open source component which has been invoked into the application, but that open source component, even though it has got a critical CVE, the 9521 that you see over there, that is not controllable, right? So effectively, if you think about it, this is going to become a critical vulnerability, and somebody is going to look at it and say, how do we ensure that this vulnerability is mitigated? Finally, we talk about reporting and management. Again, this is a key component of any security initiative, because at the end of the day, unless you can't measure what you are doing, there is no use of that security. This is where we provide the Software Security Center. The Software Security Center, potentially, as I was mentioning earlier, is the single platform from where you can kind of get a holistic view of what's happening in your environment and provide that insights for the folks who are going to be working on it. This is what I had to share today, security within your DevOps process. As you saw through some of my messaging, that we bring different components and different life cycle of the CI/CD pipeline and ensure that some of this information becomes relevant to the customer for their Devsecops initiatives. Thank you so much. I can take some questions if there are any.
Hi, Apurva.
Hi.
Okay, so we do have a couple of questions. The first one is, can we force software companies to use Devsecops?
So if you think from a context of forcing companies to use Devsecops, I think the better way is to potentially go back to those companies and say, do you have visibility of what you are using in your software supply chain? There are a lot of companies today who potentially don't have visibility that their application code has a very large component of open source components, and those open source components are vulnerable. The moment customer looks at that software bill of material, it becomes hard evidence for the customer to see that, yes, there is so much vulnerability in my environment and I should be doing this. So instead of forcing it upon them, you can potentially justify the aspect that you want to potentially provide to them.
Okay. The next question is, which is recommended in companies, using DAST and SAST separately, or IAST, which is both of them combined? This is very confusing. So
that's a misnomer, because when you think about SAST and DAST, the SAST, DAST, Our recommendation is to use both of them together. The reason I mentioned earlier is the fact that SAST is looking at the source code when it is not in execution. DAST is looking at the source code when it is in execution. So think of it in this manner that when the DAST is looking at it, the crawler is also trying to look beyond the code. The crawler is trying to go in and say which are the other domains this application is touching upon, which are the other components on the network this application is going to touch upon. So SAST will not have visibility of those components. DAST will have visibility of those components. So the recommendation would be that you use SAST and DAST together. Now coming to the IAST, the interactive application security testing, the reason I said it's a misnomer because Gartner is potentially trying to bring out IAST as a specific segment. And if I may call from my own personal opinion, I think that's not the right thing to do. Because if you think about what IAST does, IAST basically gives you additional control on your production application by putting an agent on that application. And now you can potentially program that agent to say, instead of that field taking 10 characters, give it 8 characters and tell me what happens, right? So IAST is basically you interacting with the application as if a hacker is trying to hack your system. So if you think about IAST and you think of the combination of SAST and DAST, they are two different scenarios, right? So I would recommend that if you have the tools or if you have that vision, you should use a combination of SAST, DAST, as well as do the software composition analysis, because as I mentioned, most applications will have open source components into it.
Okay, so I think that's it with our questions as well. So thank you so much, Apurva. I think that presentation was also great with the animations. It helped understanding the flow of what you were trying to explain as well. That was phenomenal. So thank you so much, Apurva. It was a pleasure hosting you at reInvent, and we look forward to having you back for our future editions as well.
Thank you so much, Aditya, and thank you so much, audience, for giving me this time.
Have a great weekend, Apurva.
Yeah, thank you.